Welcome back. This is the first lecture of the first week. And the reason I started by saying welcome back is if you are watching this lecture, I'm assuming you've already watched the welcome video and are ready to get started on the class. So this is something that you've already seen me, even though I still haven't seen you. So that's why I say welcome back. To begin this course, we need to ask the question in terms of what it actually is. The title is History B354, The Reformation. But what is the Reformation? It's a problematic term. And so today I want to begin by trying to set the parameters and approaches for understanding the material that we'll be seeing from this point on in the course. This concept of Reformation, what was it? How do we approach it? What do we make of it? And how do we understand it? Those are the big questions. So here I go to the first slide, the Reformation. And if people are asked in general, what is the Reformation? I think a lot of people would say it's a period in history. We have a time in history of the Reformation, usually said to begin with Martin Luther, posting his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church on October 31st, 1517, and goes to sometime in the maybe late 16th, early 17th century. To see it as a period, though, is problematic because of the term. Because a lot more was going on at that time. We could use different terms to describe the same period. And so the term Reformation, what does it signify? What does it really mean? That's what we're trying to get at. And I pose the question of the issue of historical periodization itself. How do historians chop up the time of the past, so to speak, to demarcate historical periods? It is all an issue of historiographical traditions, what historians have seen, how they label it, how they discuss it. I think most historians would say that Europe in 1300 was very different than Europe in 1600. But how do we get from point A to point B? When does that change begin? When does it end? How do we understand the past? Because in so many ways, the past does not exist. What we have are artifacts that exist in the present that signify that which no longer exists. The term the Reformation, like so many historical terms, is a category. It is a term to encompass many different developments. And we often mistaken that for a set given concrete period. The same problem we have with all such terms, such as the American Revolution. There was no such thing as the American Revolution. There was a period, a chronological period, that historians have referred to as the American Revolution. But when does it start? When does it end? Does it start with the Declaration of Independence? Does it start with the Boston Massacre? How do we understand those things? And how we describe and label the past affects our understanding of it, which then affects ourselves and our understanding of ourselves and how we came to be where we are. So that is kind of the problem with historical periodization, is it is artificial. Now, another problem with the Reformation, as a concept, as a term, is that so often it has been traditionally been distinguished from late medieval reform. And so we see periods of reform in the later Middle Ages that then only in the 16th century become the Reformation. And that's something I'll be addressing probably most of this course, certainly the early lectures, because that really is a false dichotomy. And the word that was used repeatedly in the later Middle Ages was Reformation, reformatio. We need to have a complete, thorough reformation of head and members within the church. We'll be seeing how that plays itself out as we go. So I would warn against this distinction between late medieval reform and early modern Reformation. Now, as you'll be seeing and reading, I have introduced the term the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, even though that movement or series of movements and developments, as I'll be talking about in later lectures, did not actually change things that much. We'll be talking about it later in terms of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages having quote unquote failed because it did not bring about a thorough reformation in headed members. Even though the urgency was there, the perceived need of it was there, the call for it was there. It was only then in the 16th century that we begin to see pretty radical change. Pretty much radical change. And we'll be talking about that shortly as well. And what we begin to recognize is there's no single thing that can be called the Reformation, but there are various patterns of Reformation. I'll be addressing some of these patterns as we go through this course, of which the Reformation of the later Middle Ages is one such pattern. Luther's Reformation is another. Calvin's is another. The Reformation of the Radical Reformation, what's been called, is another pattern. The English Reformation is another pattern. And even the Catholic Reformation is another pattern of reform. So there was no time that there was a single Reformation. Now, this too is a problem because so often the term Reformation is used theologically rather than historically. In confessional historical scholarship, which has been going on since the 16th century, less so today, but it's still there present, sees the Reformation as the breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I'll be addressing those questions as we go further too in this course to hope to show that is a skewed understanding and it's based on the theological perspective. But if we begin to see different patterns of Reformation, we begin to understand these developments during this period of between approximately 1300 and 1600 as a series of radical changes that was going on in society. And our question is, how do we understand this? And then, so here I have the last little point on this slide, theological understanding versus a historical understanding. Because a theological understanding is one thing. Historical understanding is another. Now, there should be a relationship, I would argue, but there often isn't. And the point is not to defend a theological position or a theological tradition, but to come to an historical understanding. Now, I talk about theology and history in the readings. One of the readings for today, the History, Theology, Religion, and Myth, is posted in the essay. And I hope you will take that into consideration and note, because as historians, we cannot pronounce on truth. I've often said this, I often do say this in my Western Civ classes and all the classes. For the historian, whether or not Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, dead, and was buried and rose again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures and ascended into heaven, blah, 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 blah. Those creedal statements, whether those are true or not, is not something that the historian can determine. What the historian can look at is how many people came to believe that and what impact did that belief have. That's what the historian has to look at. Distinguishing historical understanding from theological understanding. Now, that does not mean that the historian, myself included, doesn't have their own theological positions. I do. I'm assuming all of you do too. And by that I mean whether it is a given theological tradition that came out of the Reformation, or if it's atheism and it's nothing. That too is a theological position, because it's a position on God, etc. So whatever your views are, whatever your beliefs are, those are your beliefs, and that's fine. But what we're looking at here is historical development of what happened during this period of approximately 1300 to 1600, how we understand the change, and what do we label it? How do we call it? How do we come to a sense of, oh, now I can understand more of what was actually happening, which then for theological reflection needs to serve as the basis thereof. That history is the basis of theology, not theology is the basis of history. So we'll be talking more about that as we go. Which then brings me to another question, the major question for this course. And if you've had a chance to look at the final exam, you will see that the final exam asks this question: was the Reformation a revolution? It's a difficult question. Whether we call it a Reformation, whether we call it simply the emergence of early modern Europe, whether we call it a revolution, that doesn't change what was going on and what happened. It's a matter of understanding and how we label things and how we conceive and conceptualize the past. When we label things, which is just something that humans can't help but doing, as part of how we learn is to label things, identify and label things, categorizing. We impose a meaning on the past. That is unavoidable. There is no single truth in history. Or at least if there is, it's very differently conceived than as popularly thought, or seemingly as popularly thought. We can make true historical statements, but that's different from a truth of history. There's no one set truth because, again, the past does not exist. It did exist, but we don't always know what it was. All we can know about the past is our analysis of the extant evidence in the present. I'll be saying more about that shortly. So how we label and categorize what we think were events, developments, etc., affects how we understand all of that. And revolution is a term that in some ways is more radical than the term Reformation. It's almost we go from reform to Reformation to revolution. Now, the term revolutionibus, or revolutio, was first kind of used by Copernicus to refer to the orbit revolution of the heavens, the Revolutionibus Orbium, which was published in 1534 or 43, I forget actually off the top of my head which. But it is a complete turning around. And we know the term because of what has often been referred to as the Age of Revolution. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and on we go. It's seen as an overturning of government, overturning of society, overturning of traditional norms, let's say. So the extent to which we call the Reformation a revolution is a big indicator of how we understand what was going on. And there have been books written about it. Was the Reformation and Revolution? Scholars can debate it going back and forth. And what extent was it? What extent was it not? We'll be seeing some of those aspects and problems. But that is kind of what your final exam for the whole semester is asking you. On what basis do we call these changes during this period, 1300 to 1600, a Reformation or a series of Reformations leading to the emergence of something called early modern Europe? The two is a label and a category, no longer medieval, because in 1300, Europe, I think most scholars would say, was still medieval. In 1600, most scholars would say it is then early modern. What made for the change? How do we understand that change, and how do we describe it and label it? That's what we're getting at. It's more than just semantics. It is basic understanding, and to analyze our own understanding and to broaden and deepen that understanding. My point here is not to undermine anybody's beliefs and faith. I'm happy to talk about that privately on Zoom or in my office hours or whatever. But in terms of being an historian, we need to look at the evidence that exists, because that's the only way we have to be able to say anything at all about the past. And this is a major question: Reformation or revolution? Or is Reformation itself a revolution? How do we understand those things? It's all about definitions and concepts and labels. This course is called the Reformation. That too is a label, a concept. But what is the content of that? How are we to understand what it is that we're talking about? That is what I want to problematize for you, not only now as we begin this course, but throughout the entire course. What was this thing that we refer to as the Reformation? And if we can identify something about it and describe it in some fashion, is that then, or was that then, a revolution? And if so, How so? In what ways? If in other ways, not. How not? And why not? That's what we're trying to get at when we get to the end of the course. And we'll see all kinds of developments as we go through it. Reasons to call it a revolution, reasons not to call it a revolution. Partly this, partly that. It gets very complex. But that's kind of what our point of departure is in some ways. And that brings me then again back to the question, which I briefly have referred to, of belief, truth, and history. Now, I have two readings for this week, both essays of mine. Long story there, part of a major project I've been working on for quite some time called On History, which has gone from a 1-volume to a 5-volume to a 3-volume work, and I'm not sure where it is right now, but these two essays are extracted from some instantiation of my work on that major project. And so I hope you will read them, because the first, on narrative, talks about how we create the past by retelling it. The stories we tell about ourselves, and how narrative and history are very closely related, and they're related to identity, who we are, how we came to be where we are, and what does it all mean. And so how we describe things, how we describe the past, affects our understanding of it. The other one then is history, theology, religion, and myth. And there I give some basic definitions, which I would like you to know and to be able to grasp and use for this course, because those are the definitions of those terms I'll be using. The discussion for this week is the distinction between historical theology and the history of theology, whereby I would claim that the history of theology is an historical discipline, whereas historical theology is a theological discipline. But those, again, are based on definitions and how we define our terms and what we're actually talking about. But belief and truth, and somehow putting it all together with history, because if we believe that something is the truth, then the truth has always been the truth. The truth does not change. But I want to pose here, as I have on the bullet points on this slide, a distinction between belief and reality. We might believe something to be truth. That does not mean it is. We can be personally convinced that the world is flat. That does not mean that it is. It may mean that it is for us, that we're convinced of it, we believe that. That's distinct from the reality of the earth. So many other concepts are like that, or beliefs are like that. We believe something, we might believe it thoroughly, but then what is the reality? And then how do we compare the belief to the reality? What evidence is there? That is the big question, because if we are believing something that isn't verifiably true, we have a problem. And that is then the distinction between the truth and that which is true. The truth is a concept. That which is true refers to propositions, statements that historians make, or that anybody makes. If I make like the creedal statement, just to go back to that example, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead on the third day, is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, the historian cannot determine that question. It's a matter of belief and faith. But the historian can answer the question, was Jesus of Nazareth an historical individual? Now, there's not a lot of evidence to prove that, but there's sufficient evidence that is, for me in any case, compelling that yes, Jesus of Nazareth was an historical person. Okay? That's the historical approach. And that can be a true statement. Is it the truth? Well, if there is such a thing as the truth in this abstract, atemporal, universal sense, then that which is true is the truth. But we often believe the truth independently of determining that which is true. The historian cannot determine the truth, but the historian can determine that which is true based on reality, based on the evidence. That is a major distinction I want you to keep in mind. Because if we don't do that, we run into the problem of how do we know and how do we solve the discrepancies? If I believe X is truth, and if you believe Y is truth, who's right? I know I'm right. You know you're right. How do we solve that problem? What's the evidence? Well, it has to be based on true propositions and not in historical propositions, because we cannot find anything to prove our beliefs. Does God exist? I may claim that God does not exist, and I am convinced of that. That belief, that truth for me, is distinct from the question of whether God really exists. Because if God exists independently of any of our conceptions. Now, if God does not exist, likewise, God does not exist independently of any of our conceptions. If I want to say that God does exist, but God doesn't, the truth, that which is true, is that God does not exist. But that is not something that we can prove based on evidence. We cannot prove either proposition, that God is or that God is not. That cannot be proved. That's a matter of belief and faith. Most of what we do in our lives, when it comes down to it, is based on belief. You are watching this video because you believe that this will help you pass the course or something like that. Because if you didn't believe that, why watch it? Why take your time to watch it? Why take the time to listen and question? If you go to university, why are you going to university? Because there is a belief there that it has something of value or benefit for you, even if it's just something that you want to do. It may be that, and it may not be. We don't know. But it's based on a belief. I'm sitting in a chair right now, talking to you, because I believe that this is a way to communicate with you, even though we're not seeing each other face to face. And if I all of a sudden said, I'm going to stop this lecture right now because I am thirsty, I need to go out and get a drink of water. If I were to do that, that would be based on the belief that would be, number one, possible for me to do, that I actually could get up out of my chair. Because how do I know? I've always been able to, most of the time. I've had hip problems and issues. There have been times when I haven't really been able to get up. But in general, I don't even think about it. I just get up out of the chair. But that's based on an implicit belief that that is possible. Because if I were sitting in this chair, and if I did not believe that I could get up out of this chair, I wouldn't even try. So belief is fundamental. But how do we settle discrepancies with conflicting beliefs? One is evidence. If you believe that the earth is flat, there is sufficient evidence that can be examined to prove that it's not. But if you believe that God exists, there is no sufficient evidence to prove that God exists. If you believe that God does not exist, there's no sufficient evidence to prove that God does not exist. There's evidence to lend credence to either belief. Same thing with religion as such. If you believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity and the Savior, blah, 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 great. If you believe that Muhammad was God's prophet and is the last revelation of the truth, great. You can't prove that one is right and one is wrong. What you can do is prove and argue for how those beliefs developed, on what basis did they develop, and why did people continue believing them, and what difference did that make? That's an important point to make. So, we have to make those distinctions. And to do so, we have to realize that history is not to be in service of our beliefs. Because I have up here the science of doing history. History is, as I take my Nature of History H217 course, is always necessarily science and art. The science of history is not reconstructing something as it actually happened. It is analyzing the extant evidence. And on that basis, then the art is to apply meaning to that analysis. What does it mean? We have texts, extant texts in libraries. Let's say of Luther's Lectures on the Romans. Wasn't really discovered until 1908, I think it was. We knew that Luther had lectured on Romans all along, but the actual text was not discovered until 1908. Actually, by a fierce opponent of Luther's, Heinrich de Niefle. But that's another long story. But then what does it mean? And when you make that kind of a discovery, you first have to show that, oh my God, this actually is Luther's Lectures on Romans and not somebody else's. That is what I mean by the scientific approach to history. But if you just say, yes, this was Luther's Lectures on Romans, I can prove it historically, then the question is, so what? What does that mean? What difference does that make to our understanding? And that is where the art of history comes in. For me, it's always the case. And this I kind of follow Leopold von Ranke, who's considered the father of modern historiography. Von Ranke is usually misunderstood and often quoted as saying that the point of the historian is to recreate the past as it actually was, which is a complete misquotation of von Ranke and a complete misunderstanding of von Ranke, but that is how he is portrayed as the originator of scientific history of recreating the past as it actually was. That was not his position. He is the one who said history is always necessarily science and art. We have to have the science as the foundation of the art, because if the science is faulty or wrong, if our understanding and analysis of the extant evidence is wrong, our attribution of meaning to that evidence is going to be skewed and incorrect too. That's why I say too, theology is ascribing meaning to something. If it is based on an analysis of the evidence, then it is very much, a possible, acceptable, valid belief and interpretation of the meaning. I'm not going to be going into the meaning of history or the meaning of the past or the meaning of the Reformation, except in some ways. I'll talk about what it meant to Luther, what it meant to Calvin, and those things individually, but I'm not going to be standing back and pronouncing on is the meaning of the Reformation. Not at all. But we can look at the evidence and what does the evidence signify and how do we understand it and interpret it. That is the task we have before us with respect to whatever this term, the Reformation, signifies as a categorical term to describe any number of events and developments. And the problem is that our own beliefs about truth, about theology, ultimate reality, affect how we go about doing so. So we need to try to understand, how do we manage our scientific analysis of the extant evidence with our beliefs about reality? So how do we manage reality that actually is, and then our beliefs about it, and what is in truth and that which is true? That which is true are true statements that is supported by evidence. That is the approach that I'm trying to take, maybe not all the time in here, but basically that's what this is all about. How can we make true statements about the past that no longer exists based on the present evidence? That is the issue. And then the art comes in as, and what does that all mean? And not so much what does it all mean for me, but what does it all mean for our understanding of the past? If I were a complete, thoroughly convinced atheist, I should still be able to talk about what the Reformation meant, not simply to support my own position, but to understand it at the time. What did it mean at the time? What difference does it make? Now, ultimately, I could say, well, since I'm an atheist, footnote, I'm not, but okay, if I were, it was all based on an hallucination, illusion. So it's kind of all stupid. Fine, that could be. I can't prove that it actually was or is. I can't prove that it's not. But that is missing the question. The question is, how did this come about? How did the changes that we can see in the extant evidence come about, and why? How do we understand the past in its own terms? How can we understand Luther? Big question. How can we understand Calvin? Big question. Not just what we think or believe about them, is how do we actually analyze the extant evidence to be able to say something about them? And that is difficult, and that is scary, because you're making statements about people who are dead, who cannot speak for themselves. The historian has to be the spokesperson for the dead. That's a huge responsibility. They can't stand up and contradict us, but evidence can contradict us. That's the issue. And then how do we ascribe meaning to it, and on what basis? And the meaning that I'm going to be looking at in the course of this course, so to speak, the next 15 weeks, is what did it mean for our understanding of the emergence of early modern Europe and the transition from medieval Europe to early modern Europe. That's what we're looking at. And then do we describe that change from medieval Europe to early modern Europe as a revolution? And if so, why and how and what way? And if not, how and why and what way? That's what we're looking at, and that's what we're trying to get at. Again, for the next part of this course, dealing with all these issues. Now, what is theology? What is religion? How do theology and religion relate? Because they're not the same thing. And we will see at times when theology basically is contradicted by religion, and when religion seemingly is in contradiction of theology, and how do those fit together? Now, I address those questions in that document, History, Theology, Religion, and Myth. I'm not going to say much more about it now, because there I give the definitions, and I want you to look at those definitions. And again, as I already said, those are the definitions I'll be using for this course. So even if you disagree with them, which you're welcome to do, I still want you to know them and realize that's how I'm defining them for this course, and that's what you need to know and be able to understand. There was a huge change in religion during this period of approximately 1300 to 1600. There was a huge change in various theological positions during this period. There's a huge change in political positions, the social positions. How do we understand all of those changes together, and how do they relate to each other? Not everyone understood all of the theological issues, which is still always the case. The religion, the religious practice and beliefs of people is not necessarily equated with the academic, intellectual reflection on those beliefs and explication of those beliefs. And there can be a real disjunction between the two. In some ways, been the history of Christian tradition all along. How do we relate the theological understanding to the religious experience, so to speak? Okay. Now, I'm just going to leave it there for now for that. Please read that document, and we'll go from there, because that is kind of, again, setting the parameters of the definitions of the terms that are going to be used to talk about this course and the change that we see. Now, I also just said that, all these different changes, and there was political changes, and there were, because in so many ways, we can see the Reformation as a political event. I'll be talking a lot more about this, because politically, what I'll be defining in the next lecture as medieval Christendom basically fell apart. We'll be talking about the transition between the myth of Christendom and the emergence of the myth of the nation state, whereby we go from the concept of a church state to state churches, even though that is also there, that concept is there in the Middle Ages as well. Depends on whether you were siding with the emperor or with the kings or with the pope. That's a tension. What is it that we're talking about? And in so many ways, it wasn't Martin Luther, when we look at this as a political event, that was the father of the Reformation, but Frederick the Wise, who was Luther's prince. And I'll be talking a lot more about this when we get there. Because Luther was condemned at the Diet of Worms in 1521. He was to be handed over to the Pope to be tried for heresy. All of his writings were to be burned. And Frederick the Wise saved him, kidnapped him, kept him safe. So without Frederick the Wise, what would have happened? Now, those kinds of questions are speculative. We can never know. They cannot be answered. I think they're important to consider the what ifs, but I would never ask anyone on an exam to write what would it have been like if Frederick hadn't been. I know I've heard people who have done that on exams. I think that's wrong because there's no way of then evaluating the accuracy of the analysis or the speculation. Because all we can do is know what did happen based on the extant evidence. But that gives a very different perspective on the Reformation if we see it as a movement that began not with Luther, but with Frederick the Wise in the opposition to the emperor and the Reichstag, as well as into the papacy. We'll be talking about later how this period unleashed a series of civil wars, basically, within the empire, within France, eventually within England. So was this event a political event, and was it a revolution? Was it a revolutionary political event? If we go back to that definition or understanding of revolution, not from Copernicus, but the age of revolutions from the American and French and industrial, etc. revolutions, were all political. Was the Reformation a political revolution? If so, how so? If not, why not? But those are the concepts we need to address. How does understanding the Reformation as a political event fit in with understanding the Reformation as a theological event or as a social event? I don't have the answers for that. That's one of the things that I'm asking you to answer for yourselves in your final exam. What do we do about it? How do we come about it? How do we know? How can we argue and make our case? So that is too an issue in terms of the reading. I hope you will read the introduction to the course document and the historical argument document. I'll be talking more about those later as we get close to the assignments, the text analyses, looking towards the final. But that's what it's all about. That's what historians do. We argue a case based on the evidence. So look at some of those documents and think about how we can formulate a valid argument, i.e., how can we make true statements about the past based on the extant evidence? That's what it's all about. And then how do we describe that? How do we ascribe meaning to it? That's what this course is about in so many ways, and not much more, but that is a whole lot in itself. Because what we're getting at is a relationship between politics, beliefs, and ideologies. And ideology is a term that I think is very important. It often has negative connotations because of Marx and Engels, the German ideology. Scholars have said, Terry Eagleton has said that ideology is almost something that you have. I have a political philosophy. You have an ideology. We all have an ideology. And ideology is simply the intellectual structures that allow us to make sense of the world in which we find ourselves. What was the ideology behind the various patterns of Reformation? How did ideology change? When I talk about the myth of Christendom, that was an ideology. When I talk about the myth of the nation state, that was an ideology. An idea, a concept, a way of understanding the world in which they found themselves. How do we understand ourselves in our world? What's our ideology? And how then do we put those together? That's kind of what this is basically about. Because it's not just understanding what happened in the course of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. It's also trying to understand how does that affect our own understanding of ourselves today. That's what we're getting at. That's what we're looking at. All righty. Here we go. Agents of historical change. Because that question of how do we come to an understanding of the past and how does that affect our understanding of ourselves today is dealing with historical change. Because time is a mystery. History deals with time, but time is a mystery. What is time? Augustine, Augustine of Hippo. Footnote, I often say Augustine or Augustine. Long story, same person. You'll be hearing more about Augustine as we go through, or Augustine of Hippo as we go through. He dies in 430 CE, one of the major church fathers, Bishop of Hippo. In his Confessions, says, I know what time is until somebody asks me what is time. I don't know, because the past no longer exists. The future does not yet exist. So all there is the present. But how long is the present? He says, as soon as I articulate a sound of a word, it's gone. So when I speak a word, the first sound is in the past by the time I get to the last sound. Meaning, we can infinitely divide, quote unquote, the present to whereby the present really doesn't exist. Yeah, here we are. Here we are. I mean, when I began this lecture, that's already past. That's already in the past. We say, well, it's being recorded. Yes, it is being recorded, so you can go back and look at it. But the actual event of my recording it is over and done with. And this lecture, as it is posted in Canvas for you to watch, is evidence of something that I am doing right at this moment. But it will be past when you're watching it. How do things change? How does time change? What causes change? Now, causation is a problem that is also very complicated. And I would, the long story here because it goes back to the 19th century debate between explanation and understanding in German philosophy, Verstehen and Erklärung. How do we describe change over time? What drives change over time? Is it ideas? Is it power? Is it money? I mean, these are asking the large questions. That's where Marx, was often misunderstood too. But basically, Marx was offering a theory of history, of what makes history change. And it's the tension between the haves and the have-nots, the capital and labor for Marx, is what brings about change. That's just one view. There's different other views of what brings about change. There's no single right view. I'm not going to be telling you, and this is what brings about historical change. But it's something to ask ourselves. How do we get from point A to point B on the great timeline? And for this course, that timeline is circumscribed by what we refer to as the dates 1300 and 1600 in Europe, in which there are, intellectual, social, political, economic, religious, and theological factors. How do we put it all together? How do we find meaning? How did they find meaning in the past? Have their systems of meaning? Because what we're really doing is looking at various systems of meaning. If I assert that I'm an atheist, that is a given system of meaning. If I assert I'm a Muslim, that is a given system of meaning. If I assert that I'm a Baptist, that's a certain system of meaning. If I'm a Lutheran or a Catholic or Episcopalian or whatever, those are all different systems of meaning that all fit together in a certain coherent way, even if not uniformly. And that is the question of what doing history is about. How do we understand these various systems of meaning, how they developed, and how they change over time? And doing of history, as I've already said, has to be always a science and an art, because if it's not based on the science, the analysis of the extant evidence, it's then just supporting a given ideology. The question of history is to always make us question our own understandings. Always question our own understandings. If I believe X, why do I believe it? And if I look at X historically, does that change my belief in X? I'm not trying to change any of your beliefs. I hope this course will allow you to reflect on your beliefs and either change or have come to a deeper understanding of your beliefs, if that makes any sense. I'm not going to be grading your beliefs. I'm going to be grading your analysis of the extant evidence, which for this course is the course material. That's what the lectures and the assigned readings. That is what doing history is about. Looking at the extant evidence and then scientifically, and then finding meaning in it as it applies to the meaning that was created in the past, because we are always creating meaning for ourselves by the stories we tell. What does it all mean? I don't know. But people describe implicitly or explicitly the meaning that they see for themselves in life in various ways. Why? How? On what basis do they have those beliefs about meaning? If we look at the question, what was the meaning of Luther's posting of his theses? It's not about what does it mean to me. It means what did it mean at the time? And only then can we say, okay, if I believe that, does that affect how I view that event, so to speak? Does that affect my meaning that I do find for myself? Or whatever else? I hope this is kind of clear in terms of what I'm trying to get at. Understanding how meaning was created in the past, on what basis, and what makes for historical change as it means to reflect on our own understanding of the meaning that we see in our own world today. That's what this is about. Looking at this period from approximately 1300 to approximately 1600 that traditionally has been called the Reformation, even though the Reformation traditionally has not been seen as starting in 1300. I'll be talking more about that as we go. I hope this talk, this lecture, has given you things to think about in terms of doing history and doing this course and what the course is about and how we're approaching it. Because that is too what this course is all about, is to deepen understanding, historical understanding of a given period that was of central importance for the development of Europe and of the United States and of ourselves still today, when we include the theological positions that are still around that came out of this period of the Reformation. Now, that was a lot, I know, to take in. We'll be coming back to some of these terms, concepts as we go through. But in the next lecture, we start off with basic structures of Christendom, which I will try to squeeze an entire semester's course into one lecture. But we need to talk about what then changed from what. If the Reformation was a change from 1300 to 1600, what was it a change from? That's where we will begin then in next lecture and go from there. If you have any questions, as always, please email me. Thank you for your patience, and I will be back later, and I will see you again for the second lecture of this first week of this course. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.